So, well, I will start quickly because we have like 10 minutes delay. So, this is basically who I am. Basically, I think the most relevant thing that I've been doing in the last 8 years has been leading or helping this dashboard team to deliver and, well, basically achieving what is right now doing. So this talk actually was born as a reflection on, during the last year, couple of years, I've heard many times, how can we make Ceph simple or more simple? And I wanted to, first of all, gather the feedback from the community. And if you do some Google search or, well, ChatGPT or whatever, and you ask it to gather the feedback, you will find many quotes, many complaints about in the community, right? Like, yeah, it's flexible, but yeah, it allows you to do things in the wrong way. It's hard to debug, hard to troubleshoot. I think that's also very commonly heard. It's too complex, and it's basically you can, even with simple configurations, things can get quite messy. So that's a general feeling, right, in the community, that Ceph basically it's not only complex but complicated, right? So basically, what's the issue here, right? I think users share this perception that Ceph is complex. So what's the solution? Let's make Ceph simpler. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you much. So, well, no, obviously this requires more reflection, right? So the first thing is the problem with simple, right? And nowadays, as you know, LLMs permeate everything. We are starting to realize that language is a very relevant matter. So when we say Ceph, let's make Ceph simpler, what are we trying to say, right? If we try to rephrase that as in a user story style, first thing that we need to look for is who is the beneficiary of that simple thing, right? The attribute. And what's the purpose of that, right? And what specific part in Ceph that we want to make simple or simpler, right? So this is an example of a process of simplification that I extrapolated to the past how the Ceph logo might be in this steampunk thing to a super minimalistic approach. So that's simplification, basically. It's from a reproduction point of view, we are simplifying the process of the Ceph logo, right? So the version of the right side is the simplest way that we can express the logo, right? It's just a dot. It's the most minimalistic approach. But when we are talking about simplicity, we have here 4 examples. All of them are the same object, the same tool, right? It's basically a seat, a chair, right? So the first side, which one could you say that is the simplest one? Any volunteers?
The stump.
The stump, okay. Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because it's really easy to make.
Oh, you need a tree.
Yeah.
Okay. Where do you get one? Well, we are in Canada, probably that's the wrong question. Maybe in other countries might be more challenging, right? But yeah, okay. But I mean, if you want to bring your chair with you, maybe it's not really portable, right? So it's not simple to transport, right? So the funny thing is that from all these different seats, from all these different chairs, the simplest one according to our technology nowadays, it's the middle one, is the white one, is the monoblock. That's the name for that ubiquitous chair that you have probably seen in many places. And by the way, that was designed by a Canadian engineer. So that's extremely cheap to make, assuming that you have like oil extraction industry and plastic polymerization and everything. But on that, it's extremely easy to produce in series. It's easy to transport. You can stack up to 25 of those. It's really to use. There is, it's moderately comfortable, so we could say it's simple, right? It's maybe the simplest from all of them, right? So the problem with simple is that it's a very vague term, right? It doesn't really express it. It conveys too many meanings. And this guy basically reflected about this and created this term about God terms, right? Which are terms that are extremely vague, extremely open to interpretation, right? So simplicity is one of these terms, right? That's basically, you need something else. You need to add something to simplicity. And there are multiple meanings in this case. And there was another great philosopher from the last century, which was this guy, Wittgenstein. And he basically told that well, quite complicated statement can be briefly summarized in simple needs a purpose, right? You put the term in relationship with something. So you need to say, is simple to what? That's what I tried to say before with the user story thing. And also, so basically what we want to define is the simplicity under what goal is operating, right? And this is a categorization of simplicity. And the main categories are the producer, because when we talk about simplicity, we mostly talk about tools. So we have the producer of that tool, and we have the consumer of that tool. So according to that, we have all these different categories for classifying simplicity, but the top four are from the producer side are the structural and the functional complexity, and from the consumer side, operational and cognitive, they are kind of related. So we could even say that both basically comprise what we understand for usability. So when we talk about structural simplicity, we are talking about moving parts, right? What are the pieces of a tool, right? So in this very case, I fully agree. The stump is much more simpler than the ergonomic chair or even the monoblock chair. When we talk about functional simplicity, we have, I think this is very clear, so probably it doesn't require further explanation. Then we have the operational simplicity. So both are ergonomic chairs, but the one on the right side, have all these sticks that, so it's more flexible, it's more versatile, but you need to do that properly, because if you don't do that, your ergonomic experience might be even worse than with the simpler one in the left side, right? And we have the cognitive simplicity, this is harder to grasp, but basically it has to do, the operational is about the number of steps that you need to achieve an outcome, and the cognitive is about the impact, the context, all what is surrounding the experience, right? We have a bus driver seat and an aircraft or a fighter seat. So basically, structurally are very similar, but the context in which you operate both things are very different, right? In one, you are basically driving in a street or in a road, right? The other one, you are basically probably fighting in a very extreme condition. So that's basically what defines. And in the case of Ceph, probably many times we have said, okay, I may run this command, right? But the risk of screwing something by doing this is high, right? So even if operationally might be simpler, there is like a stress associated with the process of operating Ceph, which we have also to take into consideration, right? So then we have the who, right? We talk about the user, the producer, and the consumer. In the case of the software, right, we have all these different personas. Probably we could even find or look for more personas, but we have the product designer, we have the developer, we have the seller, the user, and the support engineer, right? In some cases, some of these roles might merge. So, but here we have two main categories: the one that produces, the developer, and also the product designer, the product manager, which are basically interested, for example, in that something is simple to implement, something is simple to produce. On the user perspective, they might want to have something that is simple to use, right? So these two things might be slightly contradictory. And let me try. Okay. Let me go back quickly. Yeah, that's it. So then the next goal is how do we measure, right? How simple is a tool, right? How far we are from our goal, right? So probably you have seen this meme, right? The WTF, right, per minute as a metric of astonishment, right? This is the principle of least astonishment, that you should, what you deliver, either as code or a product shouldn't astonish the user, or shouldn't astonish the reviewer, right? So we have other metrics which are more, easier to measure, like count of lines of code, files, classes, modules. We have like pseudo-standardized or old-fashioned metrics like cyclomatic complexity, dependencies, cohesion, coupling, afference. We have other metrics like duplication, the code, change surface area, or build or CI time, right, to measure the complexity of a system from a structural perspective. Okay. Yeah, we have this way for measuring the functional. This is probably more challenging because the function in software, usually they are not clearly identified. We can use commits, we can use PRs to track more or less how the functions in software are being delivered. Also, feature flags, many times it's easier to identify the number of functions that are delivered. And this feature to usage ratio, which is something that if you couple that with some telemetry, you can get to know how often or how many users are actually using. And that's something that we do a lot in Ceph, right? We really want to know from all the feature set that Ceph provides, what's the adoption of the features, starting with the Ceph version, with the manager modules, and many other things, right? And we have the operational simplicity. So this is, and I will also talk later about this, but basically the number of config settings, the config options, that's a measure. If we treat the software as a black box and we just see the inputs, which are basically configuration on the input side, that might be a good measure, right? We also have more dynamic metrics like the MTTD, which is the time to deploy. So how long does it take for a user to deploy Ceph? Also, in case of troubleshooting, what's the time to recover in case of there's been an outage? We have something which is monitor and noise, and that's connected to the fact that many times we instrument systems, we provide many metrics, but the quality of the metrics themselves are not really actionable, right? We see many low-level metrics, many inode metrics or cache metrics, and we don't really know how to relate that with the operational goals, right? And last one, and probably the most important in many cases, is user feedback. So we have a lot of that in the Ceph community. Probably many users might still think that we don't listen enough, but well, that's. We also have, with the direct user feedback, many times we also have to challenge some views, and that's something that I will also try later, because I think there are some myths around Ceph. Probably they might be 100% true 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, but I think Ceph has improved a lot since then. And last one is measuring cognitive simplicity. So this has, as mentioned, more to do with everything surrounding the use of a product, right, or of software. So, for example, in the case of Ceph, something that many times is a barrier to entry for users is the amount of new terms that you need to learn, right? I think probably the first time we started using Ceph, we wondered, what's this PG thing? What's the backfill? What's the difference between backfill and recovery? What are the PG statuses? So all these things that are structural but also exposed to the users contribute to the complexity in the usage of Ceph, right? So that's a question. Is it Ceph really that complicated? So that's an open question. What's in the audience? What's your views nowadays? And any volunteers? No. Okay. Probably, as I was mentioning before, you have to put that in relationship with something else, right? So, is Ceph more complicated than Redis? Is Ceph more complicated than or simpler than Cassandra or etcd or Kubernetes? So, we will check more or less a few aspects of Ceph that might, describe this complexity in the use of Ceph, right? So the CLI, and I will focus on the CLI because my background is mostly dashboard. So I've been talking many times about the dashboard, how to simplify the Ceph UX from the dashboard. But I think many Ceph users still rely and probably will always rely to CLI. So, and I think we shouldn't discard directly that CLI has to be tough, right? CLI should also have their own UX. So there should be some CLI UX. And during the last Silicon Valley Ceph days, I think some users were complaining about, like, the CLI completion doesn't work or never work. Why not put in some CLI completion? The truth is that that's been there. So for some reason, we still have to check, but that's there. So there's a bash completion. So if you try the CLI and it doesn't work for you, probably, yeah, we should investigate that. But it works, and it works pretty well. There is some slight delay because it actually gets the commands from the remote cluster, so it actually has to fetch the list of commands, but the completion works really well. And if you have multiple Ceph clusters, it will use the completion for its different clusters. So you will see the set of commands that are available from each cluster. And it's both server-side completion, and but the validation happens on the client side, so it's very fast. So more things about this. Just to give you an idea of the effort that the Ceph community has put into improving this, all the commands are defined with a kind of DSL language. So it's a portable specification in the sense that it basically ends up in a JSON, which is basically what the client is fetching to provide the completion. It also helps to make things consistent because we define types. So an integer in Ceph means something very specific. It doesn't really matter what's the architecture that you run in that. And also, there's been an effort to replace the syntax. So basically, for example, in the past, there were some commands that had the del or delete versus remove. So that's been changed, and now it's 100% consistent. And regarding the output, we have multiple formats in case that you want to use this or feed the output of a Ceph command into some script. So we even support XML or, well, and there is the watch mode in case that you want to actively monitor. Probably you are familiar with that, with the -w for checking the status and the events. So, and ideas to improve this experience. One is, for example, and I think we've been exploring that in the dashboard recently, is to replace the FSID or at least complement the FSID with a friendly cluster name. I don't know you, but I mean, if you have to manage more than a single cluster, the FSID is not really nice. And especially if you are using metrics and all the Prometheus metrics basically are indexed by the cluster FSID. So the possibility to map that to some friendly name and see in the Grafana dashboards or in the Ceph-Dashboard a friendly representation of that, that's something that we should probably consider, right? Also, and this is coming from the kubectl world, right? The context setting. So the possibility, especially if you're operating in a multi-cluster environment, the possibility to define, I want these commands to operate on this specific cluster, right? So you can set the context. On the completion, I didn't mention that, but it doesn't only work with Ceph. It also works with the Rados CLI, with RBD, and with the Rados admin command. So both of them have this completion. One thing that probably would help minimize this operational cognitive impact is the dry run, right? So when you do a command, the possibility to see the outcome of that command without the real impact on the cluster. So but still a few commands in Ceph or subcommands in Ceph support this. I think Cephadm does that, right, in some commands. There is some dry run support, but probably it should be desirable to extend this to other Ceph commands, right? So you can basically see the plan of what's going on and what's going to happen, right, if you apply that command. I had this idea of the format YAML, but probably that's not really. Nowadays, Cephadm, for example, revolves around YAML for the service specifications, but in general, YAML is not very used for scripting. So, but well, that's and this is a recent thing. Using newer types like Ceph byte size, for example, instead of having to define the 4 gigabytes with a whole number, right? You can use that. That's available in RBD, and I'm not sure if in other CLI tools, but well, and the last one is introducing color. So I think nowadays we are all familiar with many CLI tools that, through the color may improve the CLI UX. Cephadm, well, I hope that you all have or are familiar with Cephadm, but basically has reduced the process of deploying Ceph to a single command. It's containerized, which also simplifies the issues with the distros, and also provides extra things, non-functional requirements, like a full observability stack. So you get your Prometheus, alerts, metrics, logs. We also have centralized log collection. Tracing is also deployed for RGW. And other non-functional features like HA proxy, the management gateway, and cert managers. But there will be talks to cover this tomorrow. And the UI, well, I just wanted to mention here, in the right side, we see a form, which is basically for creating a pool. And in the left side, we see all the different commands that you need to trigger for achieving the same outcome, right? So basically, with the dashboard version, that's probably the most complicated. In general, so some of these options would be collapsed, so you would just create a replicated on an easy pool. But in this very case, I expanded all the options, like compression, QS, but basically, you can replace all these many Ceph commands with a single form. So that's another way of simplification. So I will insist that or recommend for you on using the dashboard, or at least giving it a try. And well, then we go to one controversial topic, right? The configuration. So Ceph has, probably you have heard that many times, Ceph has 2,000 options, right? Well, that's not correct. I want to clarify that. It's 2,057, right? Well, it was that when I started the presentation. Oh, I think we are close to the end of the time. Nowadays, we have a new option in the last 3 weeks, which is client respects to volume snapshot visibility. So welcome. But that's not inherently bad in the sense that this is a graph that basically shows all the Ceph config options over time, starting with dumpling to main or tentacle. Although the number of total number of options is now above the 2,000 number, the number of basic options is still very low. It's based around 70, and most of them have defaults, so you don't even need to configure them, right? They work from scratch. So if we look at this chart in a different way, in an incremental way, this is basically the number of new options added over time to Ceph, right? So we see that there is a decreasing tendency in that. We had in some versions 10 years ago, we added a lot of parameters, but nowadays that's decreasing. So I wanted to quickly mention the changes about that, about the configuration framework in Ceph. Prior to Kraken, all options were equal. So basically, there was no classification of options. There was no basic, advanced. Starting with Luminous, it was introduced this layer approach where we can classify the options on depth, advanced, and basic. There are other metadata, and after Quincy, this file was replaced with a YAML file, so anyone can consult that and check more or less the metadata. Probably that information could be used to improve even more the user experience and also the documentation, because that's basically configuration as a YAML file. And there are many things to comment there. The defaults. I check more or less how many options you need to configure a cluster. At least initially, it's only 3, right? I think it's the public address, the cluster address, if you want to have a separate cluster address, and the monitor host. That's it. Everything else has a default or is inferred by Cephadm, so it's extremely reduced the number of. We also have metadata to identify the impact of these config options, so we can see which services are affected by these config options, and also whether the config option will be refreshed on startup, or it can be actually updated at runtime. And there is a lot of metadata for documenting that. So we have a short description of the option, we have a long description, we have tags for identifying the type of options, and we also have C also to connect this specific option to other related options. So I think there is a lot of work that can be done with this metadata to improve the UX in the CLI and also in the UI. And what efforts we could do there to improve that? So far, we have just a couple of places where we see profiles. One is the erasure coding profiles. The other one is the mclock, the QoS profiles. So that was reduced, and we now have these 3 main profiles plus the custom. That's also exposed in the dashboard. On auto-tuning, there are many places where auto-tuning has been introduced. That's a controversial topic as well, because, well, some people prefer to tune manually things, but at least providing auto-tuning capacity, it's general, or at least from my point of view, it's a good thing. So these are 4 settings where auto-tuning is provided. So if you've had to deal with NUMA configuration, yeah, having something, some component that is taking care for you, for that's a great improvement. And well, so let's reimagine a bit what Ceph could be, right? From a structural perspective, we could replace the monitor or part of the monitor with things like etcd or console. Why should we have, our own key value store, distribute coordination system when we could use something else, right? Something that we could just put some wrapping layer on top of that, but basically that's an effort that we could make to simplify that. We could replace the messenger, for example, with something like gRPC. Instead of having our own transport protocol, we could use a standardized protocol. That could be another structural simplification. And what about using Kerberos instead of Cephx, right? as a way to provide authentication and authorization in Ceph. But we also have the opposite example, right? And Mark has been talking in this very same room a few minutes ago, right, about the move from XFS to Bluestone, right? In some cases, you cannot simplify things because in this very case, for example, performance is a key thing in Ceph, right? So we had to take the opposite move, like adding complexity, structural complexity, by creating our own file system. And about functional simplicity, well, this is a representation basically of how Ceph has evolved over years, right? In the first 8 years, there were just 4 different services, the core services. Starting with Ceph-Ansible, Cephadm, and Rook, we started seeing many other services around Ceph, right? And that's basically exploding exponentially. So nowadays, Cephadm manages all these many services. So I would rather say that instead of comparing Ceph to Redis or Cassandra, Ceph is not a data storage service. Ceph is a platform. It's an infrastructure provider. So it's giving you HA, it's giving you certificate lifecycle management. So all these many things that a simple, something like MinIO, for example, doesn't give you, right? So it's questionable whether this is a good thing or not. But we have to admit that with the complexity, or with all these functions, you are also bringing extra complexity, right? So you cannot have one thing without the other. So, and then about the operational simplicity, right? Recently, I've been involved in a project where we were thinking, okay, wouldn't it be possible to have like service discovery in Ceph? So we also have the monitor can now provide or use SRV entries for the clients to discover the monitor. So why not, leveraging that? Why not using service discovery for OSD to discover a monitor? So you just plug a new hard disk, and the hard disk automatically enrolls the cluster. So instead of having to manually configure that or use OSD spec for defining those things, so that type of ideas, I think, should be discussed, right, in order to improve the user experience. So, well, that's it. Now it's true. It's thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I think I took some extra time. Any questions, if we still have time? Yeah, Patrick.
So, a common refrain nowadays is Ceph is trying to be the Linux of storage. So when you showed one of that final graphs where we have all these different services built into Ceph, I think of the Linux kernel, which has an unimaginably large amount of lines of code, possibly the most of any software project. It almost looks like we're really kind of embracing that at a code level. And so it's controversial perhaps even in the Linux kernel, but you can't argue it's not successful. So is it necessarily a bad thing that we're adopting all these projects and making it part of the common ecosystem? Do you really view that as a negative, even if it's perhaps not simple?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, in terms of simplifying Ceph, I see that there is a trade-off, a kind of a trilemma thing between the structural, the functional, and the user experience, right? So if you are adding more functions to Ceph, it's, unless you complicate the code, you are not going to get a simpler UX, right? So,
so perhaps the answer is to make sure that many of these things are optional, but in fact they are optional,
yeah.
Right? Like you don't have to have NVMe over Fabric in your Ceph cluster. So, I mean, I feel like we're doing the right thing there, but of course also Ceph is becoming harder and harder to manage as a software project because there are so many hands in the kitchen. So, I think there perhaps are some ways we can try to simplify that. Maybe we should look more closely at how we could use Linux development practices to try to resolve those issues.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Yeah, right.
Hi. I think at least from a user point of view, in general, I like tools that I can launch easily, deploy easily. But it is hard, for example, when you are developing a new feature to see what parameters what are the minimum number of parameters that should I put in the feature to make it like easy, but at the same time configurable? So how normally would you like draw the line between the right number of the parameters?
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I think the introducing the complexity or the level for us, every Ceph option, I think we help, right? We help that. So developers doesn't really have to discuss, okay, should I provide or hard code the value here? I will just expose this. And even though we don't see that much increase, right, in the number of the parameters. Let me go back there, right? But that's decreasing. The marginal complexity is actually decreasing. So on every, even despite we are still delivering new features, we see less parameters added. So even if the developers are relying on the green and, yellow and orange part of the options, we don't see that much of an increase, right? So, and I think that simplifies that, because if you just want to filter by the green commands, which are the green options, which are the simple ones, that's it. You're going to stick to 74 options, and that's all the basic options that you should, or a regular user should mess with in Ceph, right? So I think it's a good trade-off, right, for developers.
Like, should it be good enough to have defaults for these green parameters to deploy like functional?
Well, actually, most of, and I would say, I think only 100 parameters don't have any default. So the remaining 1,900 parameters have a default. So that's I think it's a good figure, right? Thanks. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.